Namaste and good evening. I, Chavi Jain, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान, Nai Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we have gathered here for a special talk on the Serendipity Mindset, the art and science of creating good luck in cities and beyond. This discussion is a part of the series, The State of Cities, #City Conversations, organized by IMPRI, Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies. I would now like to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Dr. Christian Busch. Dr. Busch is a world-leading expert in the areas of innovation, purpose-driven leadership, and cultivating serendipity. He directs the CGA Global Economy Program at New York University and also teaches at the London School of Economics. Previously, he co-directed the LSE's Innovation Lab and co-founded the Sandbox Network, a global community of young innovators, as well as Leaders on Purpose, an organization convening purpose-driven CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. He is also a member of World Economic Forum's Expert Forum, a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and among Diplomatic Courier's top 99 influencers, as well as the Thinkers 50 radar list of 30 thinkers most likely to shape the future. Dr. Christian's best-selling book, The Serendipity Mindset, has been highlighted as a wise, exciting, and life-changing book, and has been featured on platforms such as BBC, Harvard Business Review, and Forbes. Thank you for joining us, sir. Our discussants for today are Mr. Sameer Unhale and Dr. Binti Singh. Mr. Sameer Unhale is the Joint Commissioner, Municipal Corporation, Government of Maharashtra. Sir has about 22 years of experience in urban governance, focusing on urban infrastructure, urban poverty alleviation, sanitation, and smart cities. Sir has also worked into e-governance and public policy issues in sustainable development and livable cities, connecting philanthropy or international development organizations and CSR to SDG in cities. We look forward to your valuable insights on this topic, sir. Dr. Binti Singh is an associate professor at Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute of Architecture and Environmental Studies, Mumbai. Ma'am is an internationally acclaimed author and urban sociologist, a regular columnist and jury member for DW Business World Media Group, and associate editor at Oxford Urbanists, a global think tank on urban issues. She is also the author of The Divided City, Policy and Ideological Contestations in Contemporary Urban India. Her ethnographic work on Lucknow is compiled into another book titled Lucknow, Culture, Place, Branding, and Activism, both launched in 2018. We are honored to have you with us, ma'am. Our moderator for today is Dr. Simi Mehta, CEO and Editorial Director at IMPRI. I would now invite Dr. Simi ma'am to proceed with the deliberation. Thank you, ma'am, and over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Chavi, for this wonderful introduction. And welcome to all. Good morning to friends in the United States, and good evening to all those here in South Asia. So today we have gathered for a very interesting discussion led by our speaker, Professor Christian Busch, who will be talking about his book and also extending the discussion to creating good luck in cities. It is a fascinating topic that we are going to witness, and we are so grateful to you, Professor Busch, that you could accept our invitation and to spend some time with us this evening. So without taking any time, I would like to invite you to begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shari and Simi, for the wonderful introduction. It's so great to be here. We were just talking with Sameer about how nostalgic I am. Actually, one of my last trips before the world closed down was to Bangalore, and so I do hope we will all get to meet in person very soon and spend more time together. For now, it's a great pleasure and delight to be here and to discuss with you. I have a short presentation, and then I'm looking forward to the discussion and conversation. I'll just upload this here. I hope this is full screen viewable by everyone. If it is, so to give you a bit of context, you know how I got to this point. I used to be this kid in high school who was very rebellious. I was kicked out of high school. I had to repeat a year. You know, I still have a lot of respect each time I meet my parents. You know, I'm just saying thank you for still believing in me. This is just giving up. And so I transferred this kind of reckless lifestyle into my driving style. I probably held the unofficial world record of how many trash cans and bins you can knock over on your way to school when you're driving. And then one day I wasn't so lucky anymore. I crashed into 4 parked cars. All cars were completely destroyed, including my own. And I won't forget the policeman who came to the scene and it was like, oh my God, he's still alive. And so this idea that I was supposed to be dead, that really stuck with me. And, you know, I asked myself all these weird questions. If I would have died, who would have come to my funeral? Who would have actually cared? Was it all worth it? Is there any meaning in this? And I only had depressing answers at that point. And so it took me on this intense search for meaning. And so I started reading this wonderful book, which I highly recommend, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is all about the question of how do we find meaning in the toughest of circumstances? How do we find meaning in crises? He survived the Holocaust, which you can imagine is the toughest situation when you are in a concentration camp. And he still kind of found ways to find meaning in every situation. In this case, for example, by saying, hey, I still want to write this book when I'm out here. And every day I wake up, I can still talk with another fellow prisoner and make them feel better. And by doing this, I have a meaning now. I have a meaning to wake up tomorrow. And I think, you know, especially during COVID now, I felt there was a lot of value in these ideas of, hey, even if it's just the neighbor that you can walk to in the morning and bring a hot coffee because maybe they can't go outside, it's those kind of small meanings that actually then make it meaningful again to wake up even in tough times. And so it's really, that book very inspired me. And what I realized is that what I enjoy doing the most is connecting ideas, connecting people, see how that all fits together. And so that led me then on this journey as community builder, entrepreneur, and later academic as well. And so, you know, one of the things why I've been so fascinated by this idea of serendipity as a mindset, and then also as a design problem that we can use in organizations and cities and more broadly, is really that idea that, you know, we always try to map everything out, but then the unexpected happens and that defines most of our life, right? And so the question really is, can we develop a muscle for this? Can we develop a mindset that helps us to make the best out of the unexpected? And then can we develop a culture in our organization, in our local ministries, in our families that helps us to actually really practice this muscle and to then see the uncertainty and see the unexpected, not only as a threat, but really also as an ally that can really help us to move forward. So what I'd love to do today, being the German I am, here's a very structured table of content. So what I'd love to do is briefly talk about this idea that when I look at a city, I see it as an ecosystem. I see it as an ecosystem of, you know, different people who ideally are enabled to be and to become who they're capable of becoming. So who have opportunity, who have connection, who somehow engage with each other in ways that help them to thrive. So it's not only just the structural problem of, you know, here's a couple of towers and then here put the people into their flats, but it's really smart design means enabling people to be and to become, as Amatara Sen would say. And then really kind of the idea also, if we look at it from a bigger perspective, cities are one of the most important manifestations of how people culminate together when we look at the world, right? It's almost like if you would look at the world as a network, cities are kind of the key clusters, right? That help us understand how people gather and how they are organized. And so the thing, of course, then is that cities not only have the purpose helping individuals, but also then of being helpful to society as motors of innovation, of social innovation, of tackling global challenges. And so there again comes the importance of connecting the dots, because most societal and environmental challenges don't have simple solutions anymore, right? They can't just be fixed by one solution that one government official comes up with and says, great, I think the city should look like this, and that's it. No, it needs the collaboration, the co-creation with local communities, with others, where it's emergent a lot of times what could be the best design. And so again, it needs a connecting the dots mindset to really be able to design the most effective cities that really help the individual, but also more broadly help tackle all the challenges that society faces. And so what I'd love today then is to briefly set that up, and then to dive into how can we develop that serendipity mindset? How can we develop that as individuals, all of us individually, wherever we are? And then kind of closing on the question of what does that mean for cities, and how can we design cities in a way that helps us have more of that happen? And I'm sure Dr. Binti and Mr. Kumar will then dive deeper into the question of how that also relates to other cities. And I think Mr. Unhale as well probably has some brilliant ideas on that as well. So in terms of the idea of what can effective cities do, if we really think about cities as ecosystems where ideally people are enabled to thrive and to build meaningful relationships and to feel community, right? What the question, of course, is traditionally when we thought about community, we thought about very localized communities, right? So you grow up maybe in your case, or in kind of like a particular village where you're part of a particular group, and that's that. Now, good city planning, of course, also is about thinking, how do I bridge between different groups? How do I bridge between someone who's in extreme poverty and for whom it's very difficult to move out of this, with a mentor in the next community who actually can help them build those bridging ties to each other? So moving from the social graph only, moving from the idea only that we are organized based on our background, to the idea of mutual interests, and how do we enable people to connect based on those mutual interests in meaningful ways. And so there's obviously a huge community building function that cities have, and that especially good city planning can do and can help us with. Now, if we think about a city then as really this space that helps people satisfy both their basic needs around safety and belonging and so on, but really also the higher needs of finding meaning, finding some kind of way of why life could be meaningful. A lot of times, of course, we see that cities fail in that regard, right? And especially when you think about how a lot of cities fail bridging between different groups, a lot of cities fail developing innovation clusters, for example, right? I remember still a lot of my work is in very low income contexts, so especially in sub-Saharan Africa as well. And I've seen a lot of effort, to just copy different places. So to say, great, here is Silicon Valley, let's just copy that and take it into another context. But of course, the problem here is that it's very often focused on quote unquote structural questions, right? Here's a great university, here's a great incubation center, here's a great company, let's just copy this and then it will work. It doesn't, right? Because it misses completely the importance of the underlying culture and how that complements how these things work, and most importantly, the underlying mindset. And that is really kind of the focus that I want to focus on today. That I think there's important structural constraints, but more importantly, it's really the mindset question of how do we get people into the mindset of connecting with each other and bridging between those different groups. And that really starts with those people who actually design these programs. And that starts with city planners, with government agencies, government officials, and so on. And so really this idea that we need creative and innovative people to approach the major challenges we face. And hopefully a serendipity mindset can help us do that. So that's really the focus. How do we create that innovation, that smart luck, and how can all of us do that in our small and big ways? Now, very briefly to just kind of make sure we talk about the same thing when we talk about serendipity. So serendipity, 50% of innovations and inventions are serendipitous, right? You see, when you look at your life, I'm sure maybe the way you found the love of your life in some ways, or in depending, on the setup, but a lot of times, or, the way you find your co-founder, or your job might be very kind of unexpected, right? And so it's those occasions. One example here, if you have erratic hand movements like I do, you spill a lot of coffee. And so imagine you're in a coffee shop and you spill coffee over someone, and they look at you a bit annoyed, but you sense there might be something in that moment. You don't know what it is, but you just sense there's something there. And now you have two options, right? Option number one is you just say, I'm so sorry, here's a napkin. You walk outside and you think, what could have happened had I spoken with that person? And option number two is, you start a conversation and that person becomes the love of your life or your co-founder, you name it. The point is our reaction to the unexpected, the reaction to what happened after the bumping into each other. That is the kind of key to determining what happens with it. And so when we think about cities, of course, a lot of times, it's not only designing for these random collisions, but it's also about thinking about how do we give people an excuse to actually talk with each other, right? Art spaces are a great example, right? If you put art somewhere, at Burning Man, for example, which is this big event in the desert where people come together and form communities, they're extremely good at putting art spaces everywhere where everyone always has an excuse to say something because they're like, oh my God, what is this? Do I understand what this is? And so you always have something to talk about. And that's really what a good city space does, right? It gives you excuses to talk with people you don't know yet and with whom you could connect. Now, here's another example of serendipity. Anyone has an idea what that might be? Any ideas? I think you can put in the chat, or any ideas what that might be? It's usually a good sign if you don't know. So that's essentially a couple of decades ago, some researchers were giving people medication against angina, the disease, and they realized that there was some kind of movement happening in male participants' trousers. And that's usually something you would be like, oh my God, that's embarrassing, right? Like seeing like a man having something weird happen in their trousers. So usually we would probably try to, ignore that, or to kind of find a better way to cure angina without that side effect. They did the opposite. They said, you know what, that's unexpected, but there's probably a lot of men in the world who have a problem in that department. So why don't we somehow try to develop a medication around? And this is how, quote unquote, serendipitously Viagra evolved, right? Which became one of the biggest products and medication helping men to actually sustain their movement in that domain. This year, any ideas what that could be on the right? Any guesses what that might be? Chicken fryer. So that is a potato washing machine. And a couple of years ago, a company in China, they produce washing machines, refrigerators, and they received calls from farmers. And the farmers said, well, your washing machine is always breaking down. Well, why is the washing machine breaking down? Well, we're trying to wash our potatoes in it and it doesn't seem to work. And so what would we usually do? We would probably tell them, well, don't wash your potatoes in that. It's not made for that. It's the washing machine for clothes, right? They did the opposite. They said, you know what? It's unexpected that farmers do that, but there's probably a lot of farmers in China who have a similar problem. So why don't we build in a dirt filter and make it a potato washing machine? And that's how unexpectedly the potato washing machine emerged as a new product. And then here now during COVID, right, we saw a lot of breweries. This year is in Cambodia, where breweries that were usually selling to restaurants. And now because of COVID, a lot of restaurants were closing down. So the breweries didn't have customers. So they realized, oh, actually, maybe we can use our alcohol as hand sanitizer and become a hand sanitizer company. And so they unexpectedly shifted and unexpectedly became hand sanitizer company. So what do all these things have in common? All these things have in common that serendipity is a process of some kind of trigger happening, right? Something unexpected happening that, it's spilling the coffee, movement in male participants' trousers, farmers calling up and saying, hey, your washing machine is breaking down, COVID happening. All these things are unexpected trigger events, right? Unexpected serendipity trigger events. But then it's about us to do something with it, to connect the dots, to actually imbue meaning in it. And so that is what serendipity is about. Serendipity is about making accidents meaningful. And as we'll talk about in a second, creating more meaningful accidents. And we'll talk more about this, how we can create more of this in cities and beyond. And then, of course, a lot of times we need tenacity, right? It's not enough to just bump into that person and, say, oh, great, we like each other. but actually now we have to go on a couple of dates. We have to, actually make an effort to make it work. And that's the same with every other or a lot of other innovations and inventions and in general, right? That we actually have to have the tenacity to go through with it. So serendipity really, and that's the fascinating thing, serendipity is about smart luck, right? It's very different from blind luck. Blind luck is just being born into a good family or all the things we can't really influence. It's just a passive event, right? But serendipity is not just a passive event. It's an active process of spotting and connecting dots. And once we see that, we realize, oh, we can create more dots, more triggers, and we can connect the dots better and learn how to connect them. And so that is really what a serendipity mindset is all about. And then cities, of course, help us to create enablers and constraints, right? To help people connect better, connect more, help them get educated differently so that they can actually connect more and so on. Now, of course, a lot of times the problem is we tend to miss serendipity all the time, right? We might not see the trigger in the moment. We might not be able to connect the dots and do something with it. I want to give you a small example. One of my favorite experiments, actually, on the importance of how actually the way we look at the world a lot of times predetermines how much luck we will actually have in our life. Now, do you think, I want you to think about, do you consider yourself to be a lucky person or an unlucky person? Just thinking about it. And so in one experiment, they took people who consider themselves to be very lucky. So people who say, good things tend to happen to me. And some people who tend to consider themselves to be very unlucky. So who say, I'm always an accident, bad things always happen to me and so on. And we all know those people, right? On both ends of the spectrum. Now, they pick one of each and they tell them, walk down the street, go into a coffee shop, order a coffee and sit down, and then we'll have our interview for the research. Now, what they don't tell them is there's hidden cameras along the street and in the coffee shop. There's a £5 note, so money, in front of the door. And inside the coffee shop, there's, this extremely successful businessman sitting next in the next seat who can make big dreams happen. Now, the lucky person walks down the street, sees the £5 note, picks it up, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, has a conversation, they exchange business cards, potentially an opportunity coming out of it, we don't know it. The unlucky person walks down the street, steps over the £5 note, so doesn't see it, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, ignores the businessman, and that's that. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both people, how was your day today? And so the lucky person says, it was amazing. I found money in the street, made a new friend, and, potential opportunity. The unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And that's a lot of times, right? How you can have exactly the same situation, exactly the same design for two people, but one actually will do more with it than the other. And I think that's something that we're sometimes missing when we think about great space design and all these different things. It's not only about the design itself. It's about how do we get people into seeing potential dots, into helping them connect the dots. And in this case, for example, it's really about also this framing idea that once we start believing that there could be something there, we start to see all the potential unexpected things. And it's actually very likely that something unexpected happens, right? Every conference, every event you're at, right? You always probably think, oh my God, how could they mess this up? How could they mess up the projector? How could this not work? Like, didn't they know? Didn't they plan enough? Well, yeah, but there's so many potential things that could go wrong that it's actually very likely that something will go wrong, even if you don't know what it is exactly. And so the point here is that we know that usually with bad things, but with good things, it's the same thing. Actually, a lot of people drop money in the street, right? Like it's incredible how much money I every couple of months I find money in the street. Like every couple of months, there's like these things are out there once we open our eyes to it. Now, one thing I want to say, just as a caveat before we dive into a couple of concrete practices, is that there's one thing to work on mindset, but also, of course, we have to work on structural inequality and really the question of what is holding people back to have more serendipity happen on a more systematic level, right? And I think I've seen that a lot in my work in low-income contexts, where the base level of someone to have potential serendipity is much lower, of course, when you grow up somewhere in Kibera in Nairobi, which is an impoverished area, than here in the West Village in New York, where you have access to networks, to education, and so on. So I think the beautiful opportunity that city planning gives us is to say, how do we enable bridging networks? How do we enable networks that help people have more of those interactions with people who could potentially create opportunities for them, and really kind of do these systemic changes as well, so that the mindset and the structural changes go hand in hand with each other. Now, what are some practices that we can all do to have more serendipity happen, and that we can then, teach others to do, being that in our government agencies and city planning agencies, more generally in our organizations? So one is asking questions differently, right? Everyone always asks these dreaded questions, right? Like, what do you do? Like all these questions that put people into boxes. And so instead of asking this, there's more open-ended questions that allow us to really engage with people, right? To ask them, hey, like, what are you most focused on at the moment? What are you most interested in at the moment? What surprises you at the moment? What are you interested? Whatever it is, something that gives us an idea of how does the person actually tick in an non-obtrusive way, versus kind of just trying to put them into a box. And that's fascinating, because then the fisherman in the village somewhere, we realize we have more in common than sets us apart. The fisherman also probably had a brother who had cancer and a sister who had something else. And so we realize there's so many common denominators once we ask questions differently. And I'm actually a big fan of this. I usually feel, whenever people say, oh, I was at this event and it was boring, a boring conversation with someone, I always feel that's more a reflection also of the person themselves, right? Because they actually didn't ask like better questions that actually could have led to a more interesting conversation. So the point here really is, it's about the quality of questions, but more importantly, it's also about how can we feed more hooks. And that really comes back to this idea, right? That we can develop more serendipity by casting hooks, by feeding triggers. And so here, one example is if someone asks, what do you do? The idea is to answer back something that casts a couple of hooks. And so Ollie Barrett, who's a wonderful entrepreneur in London, if you would ask him, what do you do? He would say something like, I'm a technology entrepreneur. I recently started reading into the philosophy of science, but what I'm really excited about is playing the piano. And so what he's doing here is he's giving you 3 potential memorable talking points where you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. I recently started hosting piano matinees. You should come by. Oh my God, such a coincidence. My sister is teaching the philosophy of science. You should give a guest lecture. The point is, all of us can make a serendipity journal where we write down what are my key interests at the moment, and then feed them into side sentences, right? Feed them into, great, like, in my case at the moment, I want to get a serendipity mindset into every curriculum, wherever I can get it into. And so it's really something that I try to feed into every conversation. And that's just something, we can do with a lot of different things. And then actually serendipity happens in the most unexpected places, where the uncle says, oh my God, I didn't know you work on this. I can connect you with XYZ person doing something different. There's a lot of practices around this. I think I just want to focus on 2 more that apply to cities a bit more. One is really around leveraging technology and space design. I think there's a lot around the question of how do we design spaces in a way that allow people to, quote unquote, bump into other people, especially more diverse people. I always loved this idea. So Steve Jobs, when he was the CEO of Pixar, which is one of the most creative companies in the world, he had architects come to him. So he essentially said, I need a new headquarters for the company. And so the architects came to him and said, great, let's do 1 building for the management team, 1 building for the developers, 1 building for the creatives. And he said, look, this is the worst idea I've ever heard in my life, because you essentially just separate those people from each other. So what he said was, look, let's build 1 big building. Let's put an atrium in the middle where people congregate. Let's put the mailboxes of people, the management team person next to the developer, next to the creative, so that they have to bump into each other because they always have to check their mail here and actually come. So the point is, we can build small nudges that nudge people to actually then realize, oh my God, this developer isn't as crazy as I thought. Oh my God, management isn't so far away from us. They're just people too. And so it's kind of this whole idea that we can build in design changes that allow people to bump into each other in a lot of different ways. And we can also do that virtually, right? So the equivalent of the water cooler moments, these moments where you run into someone who tells you about a new opportunity, organizations have started to do that online. For example, random coffee trials, where the idea is in an organization, everyone indicates a time when they are free, and then they get randomly matched with someone else of a different hierarchy level or a different community to then kind of meet them for a coffee and discuss like an inspiring prompt And of course, we can do that also with different communities, right? To say, hey, great, community A, everyone puts down a time, community B, usually, hopefully, ideally, a community that could help each other, and then essentially randomly matching them up and creating that serendipity with them in that way. And that really comes also to, and I think that to me is the most important point, that, and that's why I love, I've been doing quite a bit of work in India actually around, you know, what I've always found fascinating, the entrepreneurial spirit, right? Obviously, there's so much amazing resourcefulness and ingenuity that's happening. And I think one of the things that I've always been fascinated by is the question of how do we bring the best of both worlds, the kind of like very German planning, like rigorous, like principles thing, and the kind of more like entrepreneurial, you know, and what is like the thing that kind of brings those together, that, and you know, I think that the new type of approach that I've seen emerge here is, and it comes from research, especially within organizations, but also more broadly in broader ecosystems, is really that idea of saying, hey, here's an approximate plan, right? So this is approximately where we go. This is approximately how the city will look like. This is approximately how a company will look like, whatever. And then we're telling you already now, this is approximately the strategy, but it's part of the plan that we will revise the strategy based on new information, based on new community interactions, based on new things, so that actually we can be ready for the unexpected here, because we will probably learn new things once we are here. And so, you know, to give you an example, when COVID happened, right? A lot of the state governors here, the old school leadership approach is to say, COVID's happening, and here's the reopening timeline, and we will reopen exactly on May 15th. And so, of course, that is a really bad strategy to do, because now you have an incentive to hide data, right? Because if new data comes in that doesn't fit your timeline, you don't want that data to get out. So you hide that data, or you have to revise your timeline and you look like a weak leader, right? You look like someone, oh, you didn't really get that planning right. Versus what the smart governors did was to say, hey, look, we have two principles, economic and public health. And so this is what our North Star. Here's the strategy. We want to open up on May 15th, whatever. But we're telling you already now that we will probably revise that timeline as soon as we get more information. Now the change is part of the plan. And now I, as a leader, don't look weak because I have to revise the timeline. I actually look strong because I always told you that I will revise the timeline. And it shows that I'm actually a leader who's smart and can go with the new information that comes in. And so that's really the bigger shift, I think, behind that mindset, to say, let's get away from either planning or emergence to planned emergence. Now, a couple of implications for cities. One is really to think about how do we not only focus on local identity, local community. A lot of the regeneration programs that I've been witnessing over the years, working with governments, have been very focused on kind of local communities, and then saying, how do we revive a local community? How do we get the local community to somehow be a bit more prosperous in that part? The problem, of course, is that has a lot of times just incremental impact, versus actually thinking about how do we bridge between, you know, how do we help that community build a strong local identity, but also bridge it with other communities via different ways that we can dive deeper into, everything from cross mentoring to, you know, kind of pairing people up to work on different projects, you name it. So it's really kind of developing these bridging ties that are so important, especially for social mobility between different areas. We talked about architecture, how we can play with architecture, and also especially clever design, right? How can we use art spaces and learn from communities such as Burning Man, for example, on how you really get people together and share to really create a culture that allows to really connect with others and create that innovation. And really importantly, also legitimizing local leaders who embody what something stands for. Now, to wrap this up and to dive into the conversation, the core philosophical idea behind all of this really is that if cities are there to really enable people, it goes back to Goethe. Goethe, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, said, if you take someone as they are, you make them worse. But if you take them as who they could be, you make them capable of becoming who they can. And that's ideally what cities are, right? Cities are breeding grounds. They're ecosystems for people to become who they're capable of becoming if they are designed well. If not, they keep people down. They keep them in local communities where they can't break out, where there's no social mobility. And I think that's really the kind of idea, applying a serendipity mindset to it, to say, how do we enable social mobility in those spaces so that people can actually become who they're really capable of becoming. With this, thanks so much, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Wow, that was so amazing. Thank you, Christian. Wonderful and full of optimism and great thoughts. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. I'm sure all other participants and panelists agree with that. So I too am looking forward for a very enriching discussion and a lively one actually following your presentation. So I would like to invite Mr. Sameer Unhale to go first. Sir, over to you, sir.
Hi, I think.
Hello, sir. Good to see you. Yes.
Hi, I think I'm audible and also visible.
Yes, clear. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you. So I could reach early despite the typical metro issues we have traveling. First of all, I would like to congratulate Dr. Christian. I think it's such a wonderful book, and it has, it has got the temporal pulse. The times that we are into, it might be COVID, it might be, the anxieties of economic recovery, and probably many other such issues, which are anxious issues and moments that tend to overpower us. It is this book, which gave me a glimmer of hope, and hope is God. So I think, Doctor, I am absolutely blown over about what you have done. I think this book will be the cult book of this decade, and all the best for that.
Thank you so much.
Someone who is working with the cities, I think I always feel that the serendipity is a mindset, which is underneath the spirit of exploration, the innovation and entrepreneurship. I think if you really try to look at these words more closely, I think we will finally come down to the conclusions of the doctor that it is this mindset which is behind this very vibrant and energetic words, which has propelled our species, for that matter, our history for last half a millennia. The age of exploration, the entrepreneurship and innovation, these three words, I think, and the base of all this is this spirit of this mindset of which doctor has very beautifully brought out in his book. From the city side, I think city is both I think it's both like a brush as well as a canvas from this mindset. In fact, always felt, whether city has its own personality like an individual. I mean, we definitely try to find out whether a city has whether city, it is like a personality traits of an individual. I think even the cities have their own personalities, and very often, I mean, for someone who is staying in Mumbai, whenever I come to Delhi, I do find a typical, traits not only of the citizens there, but also of the city. Probably I think. It's not that we have to personify every city, but there is probably projections of human traits that we somehow tend to project on the city and try to probably find out, to try to correlate emotionally as to what a city is. I think many urbanists over past at least half a century have indeed dwelt upon as to how they would like to connect with the city. We had one extreme in which there was absolute alienation, absolute disconnectedness between the individuals. In another spectrum, we have cities which are being perceived as someone which have been absolute interconnectedness. I think as an urbanist and as doctor is from New York, I think we have to remember Jane Jacobs and her studies on how the cities perform and how cities function. And so definitely, I think city in itself has to be innovative. The city itself has to be entrepreneurial many a times. In fact, if we see as to why a particular part of geography or a part of territory evolved into becoming a city, I think then this the very basic principles of serendipity and other things will be found to be making its interplay. So I always found that in some cities we find a spirit of entrepreneurship there. Some cities are in building the culture of innovation, are trying to build up with sets and institutions and supports and incentives to promote, I think, this entrepreneurship and innovation, and also various other facets which I feel would be connected with this current topic, that beautiful topic that we are discussing. So I think when we think of cities who want to be themselves innovative, A, and B, cities want whom we want their citizens to be more, creative and more entrepreneurial. So I think the cities can function in both two ways. A city itself which has to be entrepreneurial, which has to be innovative, which has to explore the potential that it has. In fact, like Jane Jacobs used to say, that the replacement of imports has always been an important part of any economy of a city. That the example that is also is given is of I think some cities in Japan in which cycling was started, so a lot of repair shops came, and ultimately the imports got substituted, and those cities themselves start making bicycles and that kind of activity. So I think this the mindset of serendipity, I think it's extremely crucial. I think it's extremely important. We feel that the city leaders, the city businessmen, the citizens, and also the officials who are working with the cities, I think we'll have to bring out this mindset. And if something that can be done by the cities to create prepare policies which can promote such connections, and can we use digital platforms which the cities have. In fact, earlier when I was working as a smart city, the CEO for the smart city, we had prepared a citizen app or a city app and tried to create a facilitative framework that we could develop through this digital framework of connecting of connecting with the citizens, creating hobby groups, promoting, encouraging their interactions in various ways. But of course, with COVID times, face-to-face interaction probably does have its own limitations. But I think the basic, the fundamental idea, the spirit, the framework that this book has really brought out, I think would go a very long way to make our cities more livable. I think our cities are getting, some of the city regions are becoming very, very big. And so that maybe to 10 million, 20 million hyper cities, city regions are coming up. And then ensuring that there is some element of humanness by interconnections between them, by promoting social interactions, I think is going to be a challenge through our city planners and also city administrators. I think the spirit that lies behind this idea of serendipity, I think will be of great help. And I think this is going to, it somewhere manifest the human spirit, and if one might say, the very survival of the species, and determine the history of our planet now. And in Indian context, we always had this concept of jugaad, I think which might somehow go closer to what probably Doctor has said in Indian terms, that try to find out new ideas, try to use the whatever limited resources that we have, and come up with some new set of ideas and solutions which would to make things better. So thank you very much. I think I will stop here. It has been a long monologue. So thank you for this opportunity, IMPRI. And once again, congratulations to Doctor for a fantastic book, which will become a cult very soon. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, sir. So good to hear you and hear your thoughts. Now I would invite Dr. Binti Singh to share her comments. Yeah. Please unmute.
Yes. Audible? Okay. Thank you, IMPRI. Take this opportunity to express my gratitude for having me once again. And of course, Professor Christian, I have been following you for a long time. I have heard most of your talks on the book, the YouTube videos, and today also in the morning before coming for this event, I was going through all the examples, the spilling of coffee and the meeting with the businessman, and then a couple of more. I think one anecdote that you missed is one with your ex-girlfriend.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, yes, that one, when she said that, yeah, that itself is a thing of serendipity, and how you two went about your own trajectories and you met different people and you created luck for yourself. So that example you missed out, just for the audience. Okay, now talking about cities, So I was trying to listen to you, and I was quite fascinated with the ideas. Now, as a sociologist, we are always talking of social structures. I think you mentioned that somewhere. And so I am reminded of Anthony Giddens' theory of structuration. He founded this theory of structuration. So there's this tussle between agency and social structures all the time, and it is all about negotiation. Now, if I extend that thought to the Indian cities, or my pet topic or my research agenda for a long time is developing what this scholarly work, what we try to project as Southern urbanism, because the urbanism that is south of the hemisphere is very different from what it is in the north of the hemisphere. Okay, now I have, after going through your essential ideas in the book, and then connecting it with the city, with the Southern urbanism, I would like to highlight 4 points. One is agency, the other is flexibility, third is uncertainty, and the fourth one is informality. Now I'll just take a minute to, now all these ideas that I'm giving you only in the hope that you are going to write your next book with me. Creating my own serendipity. Please note that. Yes, I just learned it because you said that you have to say all these things so that you create possibilities for yourself. So I'm just learning from you and putting it into practice. So agency, yes, agency, because most of our urban populations live outside the master plan, live outside the formal conditions of what we call as the official city. Let me put it that way. So they are living in informal working and living conditions. And this is epitomized as the slum, the geography or the spatiality of a slum. So slum is a site of agency. It is a site of enterprise. It is a site of constant negotiation, or what Sameer said, jugaad. Jugaad for what? Jugaad for getting your electricity, jugaad for getting your water supply. So every time the individuals or the communities are negotiating with the social structures or the political structures or the economic structures, whatever they are. So that is there. So informality and agency, very much part of our Southern urbanism. And Southern urbanism is also characterized by what I call as uncertainty. And the uncertainty, when we talk of climate resilience, the northern perspective is, we have to get things right in 20 years. Over here, we have to get things right on an everyday basis, because every day is a day of struggle, So it is uncertainty negotiated on an everyday basis. So the third point. And fourth, flexibility, which I pick up from your work, the Serendipity Mindset. Why? Because it is this flexibility what we have to head for, because everything is uncertain. The COVID and whatever things have happened before, and I think more than COVID, it is the climate risk, which is really the looming challenge before us as urban citizens. And therefore, what we have to do is, as you mentioned in your book, is to be flexible. So plan little, leave the rest for human agency. So we really cannot go by the master plan, which kind of draws out the destiny of cities for 20 years, because we don't know what is going to be in the next 2 days. So how can we plan? So the master plan really will not work in this kind of a situation. We got to radically rethink that. And so we plan less and we plan better. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Binti. Your responses are amazing. And I hope Professor Christian Busch has something to respond, and several things to respond, actually. And then we'll go on to the questions. Wonderful discussion. Professor Christian, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for these fantastic observations, Dr. Singh and Ms. Unhale. It's wonderful to see it play out in those different contexts. And it really, to your point, I think it's to me one of the biggest questions exactly to what Mr. Unhale said around how do we, in a world that is now a little bit more virtual, and where we try to figure out, okay, how do we in a way make sure that people still somehow interact and feel like community and don't feel isolated in some ways. How do we bring that into the online world? And so I'm a big fan of these kind of more interest-based online communities where it's around saying, hey, how do we in a way connect people? I don't know if there's an equivalent of meetup.com, for example, in India that is strong, but it's really this idea of, I feel there's so many interest-based communities emerging where people can connect over shared interests, like cooking or whatever it is. And I think that's fascinating because in a way, then that bridges, between communities in a great way. And then once people meet up in person again, that's going to be really interesting. And so I think actually then being also the bridge, right, between those online communities and saying, how do we now enable them to have a meeting space somewhere in a local community center so that they can replicate this again offline? I think that's what I'm missing a lot of times is really in cities, people, I feel, we miss a little bit the bridge between the online and the offline. We consider it as two separate things versus ideally a conversation that starts online, continues offline and vice versa. And so I think that is a really interesting point that probably could be looked deeper into. And I also loved what Dr. Singh said around, I think Giddens is exactly a super interesting perspective on it in terms of really saying, how much is it about the individual and individual agency and what they can do versus how much is it about a social structure that in some way is there, but also to that point might be malleable to some degrees. And so how do we do that? And I think that is the wonderful policy questions also that I guess you will face. And Dr. Singh, I think your work is extremely interesting. I think when it comes to especially those underlying dynamics, right? I think there's always things we see at the surface, and then there's underlying power dynamics, underlying societal dynamics and pressures. And so I think it's extremely important to get to the root cause of things. And to that point, I think in the past, we always thought that rigorous planning means as long as possible planning. I think Dr. Singh, you said that beautifully. Versus I think now this is really more about how deep do we think about the different issues we're actually tackling, and do we understand them, and then really focusing on, okay, what does that mean today, next week, next month? How do we put that into a bigger picture, but also how do we think about it more as a system that in a way needs to be strong enough and resilient enough to actually adjust to whatever comes, versus assuming we know everything that will come. And I think that's really if there was one event, to Mr. Unhale's point, that really kind of showed us, it was COVID, right? How quickly most of the assumptions we've ever had in our life can just be taken away. And so I think it's really something. Thanks so much, both Dr. Singh and Mr. Unhale for these wonderful comments. And needless to say, I'm very much looking forward to continuing that conversation.
Thank you, Professor, for your response. So now I would like to move on to the question and answers. And very interesting questions have been raised by our participants. One is about your beautiful and non-conventional presentation. And the question is from Helen S. She asks, the book Secret also talks about the mechanisms and methods for vibrations for good luck. In what ways does your book differ? And also, what is your take on spirituality in serendipity? This is a very interesting question. Sir, if you'd like to respond to it. Please unmute.
Yeah, thank you so much, Helen, for the great question. It's interesting because one of the challenges that I found with serendipity and why I'm so excited about it was the question of, is there a science-based framework for this? Is there something that when we go there and try to understand the patterns behind all these innovations, inventions, life events, what is the pattern that we can rigorously derive? Like, is there something that really, we can see, for example, by seeing counterfactual? So like what could have happened in a particular situation, like in the coffee shop situation, if you would do a kind of experimental type experiment around it, you could see that depending on how you react to an unexpected moment, there will be different outcomes. And so you can put a scientific framework over it. And then the serendipity mindset really is saying, based on the science-based framework of that process of how serendipity unfolds, there is different practices we can do. And part of these practices, there is some, and I'll talk about this in a second, when it comes to, I think energy, for example, is so that book, you know, focuses a lot on this kind of idea of attraction and energy and energy and so on. And I think I've always been personally quite interested in those questions. Like, you know, for example, we all know that, right? When we sit somewhere where someone has quote unquote positive energy, you know, we get more excited than if there's someone who's a drainer and is like, oh my God. And that's also, of course, how we then develop, you know, theoretically, you could say, great, like that will probably then incentivize people to connect dots for each other and so on, right? So I think there is an aspect of like energy that I find interesting. I think there's interesting kind of, you know, fringe kind of research around quantum physics and things, how energy travels. So I think that's definitely super interesting. I find it personally interesting. The academic in me and the researcher in me is much more interested in the mindset question, in the question of what can we do with our mind, and how can we actually then derive exercises that are really based on the evidence that we've seen on this. But those of you who are interested, I had a fantastic conversation recently with Bernard Beitman, which is, I think, on YouTube. He wrote a book called Connecting with Coincidence. And so he's very focused on synchronicity. And synchronicity is really this idea, right, that there's a meaningful event happening that in a way we don't have a lot of agency over, right? It's like this idea, I don't know, you were thinking about this one person and exactly this moment they called, right? Or you're in the street and you thought about an old event in your childhood and exactly that moment your old teacher comes down the street, right? It's kind of those meaningful events in time that are just an event. And we essentially talked about this, right? That in a way, serendipity is much more about agency. It's about doing something. It's about connecting dots. So synchronicity is more about these beautiful, meaningful events that happen all the time. And I think the thing that he's doing, because he has dedicated his life as a psychiatrist and more broadly on saying, I want to understand these events, I think he's extremely open at trying to understand these kind of things of how could you know, for example, that your sister's in an accident when there's an accident somewhere 500 miles away, you felt it, right? Something like this where I can't explain that scientifically. So I try to not go too much into it because I feel, you know, I'm very excited about the science piece. But people like Bernard, who are also very academically rigorous in everything they do, but also say, you know what, I still want to explore something that we can't explain. I think they are extremely interesting in terms of thinking about some hypotheses. We can obviously not test them, right? Nobody knows, but I think there's exciting work around it. So very long story short, the way I look at the serendipity mindset is like a Venn diagram. Like you have all these different circles, right? And one circle is like an energy circle. And I think energy is extremely important. We can show that, right? Like we know that energy travels. We know that there is that is important. So it's one piece of it, but there's so many other pieces that come to mindset, that come to organizational culture and so on that are built around that. So I think it's an important aspect, and I'm a big believer in meditation and related things because it's really allowing us to ground our energy and to attract like energy differently. But again, I think that is more something that I personally find interesting, and that's the same with spirituality, where you know, the researcher, the scientist in me always says, well, like I want to focus first on the things that I can somehow try to really explain, and then, you know, I'm intrigued by the question of, for example, you know, I had a wonderful conversation with a priest about the question of fate versus serendipity, right? Like how much agency does a person have versus what does God do, or a higher power, or the universe, and things like that. And the way we talked about it was really, look, no matter what you believe in, you still need to buy a ticket. Like you can only like win the lottery. If God wants you to win the lottery, you still have to buy a ticket. You still have to do something to actually win that lottery. And so I think that's kind of where we ended, to say, hey, look, spirituality can be beautiful because it gives us the idea of connecting to something bigger. It gives us kind of like a community element and so on. And at the same time, we still have to do something ourselves. There's responsibility on us as well to really do something about it.
Absolutely. I was just thinking about the Venn diagram when you were talking about, and then you just spoke of it. So that is one thing. And also about, does it mean telepathy? Does it also incorporate telepathy? And when you're talking about the efforts that one has to make. So the question also has been raised by one of our attendees is that, is it about a realization that serendipity can be cultivated? Does it mean that you make efforts for the moments of serendipity, or you are always on the lookout for it?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's when you think about the moments in your life, and I'm really a big fan of the Serendipity Journal, where you write down your serendipity moments in life and then think about what is the pattern behind it. So what did I do in those moments? Was it that I was corrective? Was it that I X, Y, Z? And then also thinking about the moments where it didn't happen, but I knew it could have happened, right? Like say in that meeting, you had that unexpected idea, but you held yourself back because you felt, oh, these people are too senior for me, or, oh, it's not mature enough, the idea yet, and so and so. And so I think that is always interesting because it gives us an idea of, for ourselves as individuals, what seems to work versus what's holding us back. And I think then we can work on the things, imposter syndrome, self-censoring, like all these different self-limiting constraints that hold us back from having more serendipity. But also reversely to that point, I'm actually a huge fan of that idea that we can cultivate serendipity in the sense that by definition, we cannot know when exactly a particular event will happen, right? I don't know when I will run into an old friend or something like that, but I can always do something with that situation, right? I can always imbue meaning in that situation. It's our response to that unexpected moment that then shapes part of it. But also, as we talked about with example with the hook strategy, we can create more of these meaningful accidents and by that cultivate serendipity, even if by definition, I don't know what the outcome will be. And I think that's the fascinating thing, that by definition, the exact moment a lot of times will not be knowable, and the exact outcome is just not knowable. But what is knowable is building a muscle for making it more likely that whenever it happens, you're well prepared for it. And that's why people, think about it. If you would, I don't know, if you're playing cricket, right? And you make it more likely to win if you go to the gym or if you do your workout, right? Because you actually, like, you don't know exactly which team you will play in 5 months or which league you will play, but you will know that the better you get as an individual, the more likely it is that whatever event happens, you're prepared for it. And so I'm a big fan to think about a serendipity mindset similar to how you think about other muscles, that you have to work them out so that whenever something happens, you're ready to really act on it, but also to create more of it.
Wow, so wonderfully put. Could you also tell us about the challenges of depending too much on serendipity, especially when one is in early adulthood?
That's a great question. So I think, as someone who has certainly suffered from too much serendipity sometimes, in the sense that, too much serendipity can distract, right? Too much serendipity essentially might take you away from something that you've been focusing on. And so I'm actually a big fan of filters and thinking about filters, and filters meaning, in organizations, for example, if you look at Pixar is an extremely creative organization. They do all these, beautiful cartoon movies like Finding Nemo and so on. And when you look at them, they constantly have innovative, new serendipitous ideas, but they also have something called brain trust, for example, where informally some people feedback on ideas and just filter out those that seem really good versus those that don't feel that good. And the same, I've observed with people who have informal advisors where, if you're running an organization or if you're, in my case, it's my partner, but like there's informal sounding boards, right? Where we're just kind of saying, okay, does that make sense? And if not, the biggest like innovation in my life for myself was to have a parking lot system. So to really say, this is great, this is a great idea, this could be great, but I can't do it now. So let me put it on a parking lot. Let me write it down so it's not forgotten. So I feel better that I don't have to let go of something, but you just write it down, put it there, and that's it for now. And so it doesn't distract you. And I think, I saw that recently now with the book again, right? When you write a book or you build a company or build a city or whatever you're doing, in a way, there's periods where serendipity is more important, right? Especially at the beginning in the explorative stage where it's about getting different ideas and connecting dots more. And then at some point there's execution. And I think in that execution phase, you like literally, I was sitting in the basement or in a coffee shop where I had my headphones in just to kind of just get it done, right? And I think that's the kind of important thing, that to not be overwhelmed by all the potentiality that's out there. Serendipity is all about potentiality. It's beautiful, but if we get overwhelmed by it, we don't get things done. And I think that's really the kind of thing of saying, let's develop a mature gut feeling. And I think that's probably another conversation itself, but in a way, developing for oneself a certain idea of what are my North Stars, and then really focusing on, I only want serendipity at this point that is more related to this North Star, unless it really takes me into a beautiful new direction. And so I think those filters can be really helpful with this. I'm not sure the last sentence of the question. I don't know if I captured that. I didn't understand the last sentence.
It was, what are the challenges of depending too much, especially when one is in his or her early childhood, adulthood.
Oh, early adulthood. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question, because I see that a lot. My students, for example, there's so many things you can theoretically do, right, in life, and so many things you can be in a society. You can do this, but you somehow need to focus in some way. And I'm a big fan of really working on the idea of North Stars. So trying to figure out what are the key values I have at this point, what are the key themes of interest that are important to me at this point, and then really focusing on areas like this, trying to find communities that are in that area, trying to figure out, how do I maximize my serendipity in those areas that seem really important to me, and really kind of everything else, putting it on a parking lot and say, great, hey, this looks amazing, but maybe it's not the right thing for now. And so to really kind of, in a way, also it allows us to get to know us better, right? To ask friends, hey, what do you think? Like when you see me, like what do you think? Like I stand for, or like it's all these questions where we can, with others together, also figure out, what is it that could be really interesting for us.
Great.
I think
Thank
Dr.
you.
Singh has a, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, for Christian, question, like when we talk of nudge is about, nudging someone or that push. And whereas serendipity is more about agency, it's about the mindset. So it's coming from the individual. So how do you actually, how would you see that nudge and serendipity could come together and solve urban problems? Since we are talking, it is city conversations. I mean, that is a question I pose for you. I mean, you're no pressure to reply immediately. You can think over it.
Yeah. I think it's a great question, and it's really, to me, it's and if that's of interest, so we did a couple of very nerdy research papers about that kind of interaction between social structure and individual when it comes to everything from incubators, for example, for entrepreneurs, but also more broadly. And what I found interesting there is really the idea that how do we, in a way, the nudge itself, and the ways, for example, that I found interesting is when you build that into a tech system or like other kind of systems, right, where essentially you try to figure out how do you incentivize people to do something in a certain way. I think that is always very interesting as a kind of structural component of this. But again, I think then what's a lot of times being missed out, for example, in incubators, they might have a great structure that incentivizes running into each other, right? So they would have coffee shops where you have the queue in a way that when you come into the room, you have to bump into someone, right? Like things like this, where you can have smart, quote unquote, nudging of like you could talk, but if you don't have anything in common with that person, for example, you will not make that move. So you can push the people. You don't only nudge the person, but you can actually push them on each other, and they will still not do anything. And so the point here really is, and that's really why I'm so fascinated by that question of how do we develop education, training around developing a mindset that looks for common denominators, that gives them excuses to say, oh my God, even though you are a fisherman from a small village and I thought I had nothing in common with you, actually, if I ask a couple of different questions, we both go through traditions, we both go through XYZ. And so I'm a big fan of really, in a way, legitimizing this. And I think in social structures, in a way, always kind of not only having incentives around the nudging itself in terms of bumping into each other or other things, but also the kind of nudging people to change their mindsets. And I think that comes through training, education, and other means.
Sure. Thank you, Christian, for taking those questions very generously. I know that you have other appointments to cater to, but if you could just spare some more moments, we have a senior professor, Professor Mridul Epan, joining us from Kerala to ask you a quick question. Ma'am, if you could make your question very brief.
Yeah. No, I was actually fascinated with this whole idea of change of mindsets. I work on gender specifically, and it makes a lot of difference. We've been struggling with how to change the mindset about social norms and practices, very oppressive to women. So it really makes a lot of sense to me what you're saying. But then the way you were presenting it, or the examples you gave me, seem to be at a very micro level. How do you enlarge the reach? How do you enlarge the reach of serendipity and this sort of change of mindset, which will, at the moment, it looks as if it can be done at a very small level only. So that is the sort of thing which was niggling my head.
Yeah, thank you so much for the great question, Professor. That's a great one, right? Because mindset starts on the individual level, right? So it's all about how do we work on the individual level and in a way scale that up. And I think that is your question, right? In terms of how do we then not only keep that on a local level or keep that on a smaller level, but how do we scale that up? And so I want to give you one example that I found extremely inspiring. And I think there's a lot of examples also. So for example, I'm working with some governments at the moment on how you can think about broader ecosystems for innovation, for entrepreneurship. And within those broader ecosystems, you build in incentives, to Dr. Singh's point, you build in certain mechanisms that allow people to have more serendipity at scale. I think that's one thing, but the example that I actually find much more inspiring, that I think has a lot of bearing on probably also people in the audience, is I've been working with an organization in the Cape Flats of South Africa. So it's in Bridgetown, which is extremely impoverished area. And to your point, I think there's a lot of discrimination happen in different levels. And so what they did is they now reach millions or hundreds of thousands of people with low cost education. So essentially the idea is, 10 steps to use social media to build your organization, 10 steps to use social media to tell your story, things that kind of empower local community members to do something with their life and then to kind of prosper more. And so what they do is, because they don't have a lot of resources, they don't have a lot of kind of structural support, they essentially say, we go into different local communities, and instead of asking, what do you need, right? So the resource approach that has been the approach of government for so many years, they do the opposite. They say, what is already here and how can we make the best out of it? So, there's an old garage, fantastic. That could be a training center. Oh, there's a former drug dealer, fantastic. That person will be resourceful. They will have great social capital. If we can turn them into a teacher, you make it cool to be a teacher, to be an educator, and now education becomes cool. And so I think what they did, where they now reach hundreds of thousands of people, is to work with local organizations like hospices, like organizations where people come together, and use that very simple methodology to say, okay, how do we make people think about how they can make the best out of what is at hand, where then a lot of times that kind of connecting the dots and innovation happens. And then how do we work with the government to now take that into schools around the country? And that's, I think, where there's fascinating examples, especially around Jugaad as well. I'm sure, especially India has a lot of cool examples. Janshala, for example, when it comes to education, right? How do you have low-cost education that you scale up? But I think the initial kind of idea really is to say, how do we change the mindset on the individual level? I think it has to start on the individual level. I think for a long time, it has been top down in terms of, we know everything and now we just kind of get everyone in there. I think it is that kind of thing where you have local organizations and then you help them scale up rather than the other way around.
Sure. Thank you, Christian.
Yeah.
So,
thanks.
Yes.
I've been muted.
Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am, for your question.
Thank you, Professor.
So we'll just wrap in a few minutes. I would request Mr. Sameer Unhale to come up and also share his concluding thoughts in less than a minute. Sir, if you have, sir, please unmute. Please unmute.
Yeah, so I think we had a very exciting interaction now. And just a question on when we were discussing I think it's a game of probability. And those who have done some popular reading in quantum mechanics, or they obviously find this issue of wave collapses and the parallel realities and maybe hyperspaces and wave functions and that kind. So probably what was discussed then has been incorporated into the mathematics of quantum mechanics. That was just one point I thought I should be sharing. And secondly, of course, second issue was with Professor Rees from Canada, was how to scale it up. So I think scaling a particular activity has a optimality. Everything can't be bureaucratized and routinized. What we typically government people do, that any action, any welfare program can be bureaucratized into a national mission or a nationwide program. But it has a optimality when there is a loss of spontaneity and this innovation which sometimes is there, and then it has to be compromised with the SOPs and best practices and reporting and project monitoring protocols which normally come up. But all said and done, I think, as I repeat, it's going to be a cult book, Christian. I think I'm proud to be a part of sharing a screen with you. It is at the right moment with all these negatives going around. This is some hope that we'll be having, and thanks a lot for everything. Thank you, Simi. Thank you, congrats, Christian.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
So, Professor Binti, in 30 seconds, please, your concluding thoughts.
Yeah, in 30 seconds, I can just allude to one point Sameer has missed. That Sameer always talks of technology. So Sameer, that point only to cover up for you is how technology can be smartly used to bring governance at the doorstep of the citizen. And I mean, his district, I mean, he was the CEO of Thane, and they have done fantastic work. They have, reached out to tribal schools, the health facilities and everything, and they also got an award. Just to speak for him, Digi Thane has already got an award from the Government of India as one of the best apps and to bring governance. So technology plays a big role, and the nudge and serendipity, how they come together with the help of technology, something that we can really investigate, Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, Professor Christian, if you could just conclude, and then we'll conclude then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thank you so much, Dr. Mehta, for bringing us together. I feel this was a wonderful group to really kind of expand horizons and look at the topic from different perspectives. I really appreciate that. And Mr. Unhale and Dr. Singh, thank you so much for your brilliant insights, and also the participants who asked those great questions and gave great comments. I think to your point, in the end, it always comes back to that idea of how do we enable both the kind of, like social structure, that we can do via the more, traditional kind of, hey, here's what we can plan and here's what we can do for people. And then how do we enable mindsets, right? And I think that kind of complementarity between mindsets and social structure is important, because as the professor said earlier, I think there is just a lot of societal inequality. There's a lot of, racial, gender inequality that unfortunately is there. That means that even if the same person has the same potential serendipity happen, one might be able to actually go through with it, whereas the other one not. And so I think there's a lot around there where I'm actually a big, proponent of not putting too much just into the individual agency, but also really making sure that people have the same kind of playground to start from. And I think that's a big government responsibility. In general, though, from an individual perspective, if I had to sum up our conversation, to me, it always comes back to Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl, he, as I mentioned, right, he was in the toughest of situation he ever could be in. And the spirit was always to say, look, I cannot always pick the situation I'm in, but I can always pick my response to it. And that's my freedom. That's my life. That's where, in a way, then serendipity comes from. And I think that really, everything we talked about is about this idea that, yes, that sometimes requires a particular form of what Viktor Frankl would probably say rational optimism. It's not about kind of the naive optimism that's about, oh my God, like life is so great and everyone's great. No, the world is in a really not so good place at the moment in terms of, everything environmental, societal, and so on. But also there's great hopeful ideas out there that just need to get into the right places and need to be scaled up. And so I think it's really this kind of rational optimism that I hope comes out of the conversation we had today, which is really about this idea that, serendipity is about potentiality, and we have to see a little bit more in the moment than there is to then make that happen. And that's what innovation and smart luck is all about. So thank you so much again. It was a real pleasure. I do hope to see everyone in person again soon, to come to India again, which always is such a pleasure, especially because I think, to your point, Mr. Unhale, the wonderful Jugaad innovation, there's so much to learn in terms of ingenuity, resourcefulness. So I'm always extremely inspired when I come over. So thank you so much again for bringing our different thoughts and minds into this room.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Christian, for those wonderful thoughts. And with the hope of creating an ecosystem of serendipity, I would like to conclude and then offer the formal vote of thanks to our special speaker, Professor Christian Busch, for this wonderful lecture that he has presented to us, and also our eminent panelists, Professor Binti Singh and Mr. Sameer Unhale. So good to see you all this evening, and also to Professor Mridul for your wonderful question, and to all our participants who have joined us live on Facebook and also here on Zoom, and all those who will be watching later on YouTube and listening to our podcasts. So thank you so much, and I wish you all a very good evening and good day to you, Christian. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.